Thank you, Michael, and band. Very good, very good. He's got a little Elvis in him, don't you think? That was great. That was great. Well, as I said, I'm filling in for Pastor Kirsty, and glad to be able to do that today. She and at least a couple of her members of her family have COVID, and so we keep them in our prayers and our prayers for others who are going through the same thing. We're thankful to be here today on this Memorial Day weekend, and thankful for all that God has given us. Kirsty asked me to continue the series that she's doing on fruits of the Spirit from Galatians 5:22, in which Paul says there are certain qualities like peace, patience, kindness, and so on that grow in a person as they live in faith, as they live out the love that God has given to us and share that with other people. These things like peace grow in us. And Kirsty said is doing an interesting thing. She said she's talking about how these fruits of the Spirit not only grow, but they have an effect on life. They have an effect on other people. They have an effect on how we live our lives and how it takes shape in the community. So I want to talk about the effect of peace. And I'm going to start out in what may seem like an odd place, maybe not, in nature. When she first told me about this, I started thinking about peace. When do I experience peace? And one of the first things that came to mind was nature. I love being outside, out in the mountains, on the plains, in the sand hills, and occasionally this Nebraskan gets a chance to be at the ocean and the beach. There's such a sense of peace and overwhelming grace of God in those places. And so a few years ago, I found this book, and it's called Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard. Have any of you read it? Okay. Got to get a few more people reading here. She introduces a concept of the mother tree in the large forests that I'd never heard before. And it's an amazing thing. Now, she does a lot of research, and she's a scientist. She grew up in the Northwest and in British Columbia, and she's known the forests all her life, but her last many years has been as a scientist studying the forest as well. And she, like I said, she'll detail the research for you if you want to get into that. But I'm more interested in the bigger picture now. And when she talks about a mother tree, she's talking about it's always a large tree that's been around a long time in the middle of the forest. And they've discovered that trees communicate with each other through their roots and through the fungi that's on the ground and in the ground. And there's this amazing connection that they have. They can warn each other about pests that are coming into the forest. They can warn each other about illnesses that are happening to the trees that are destroying trees. And so the trees that get the warning then, they produce the chemicals in the trees that are able to ward off some of those things. And there are mother trees that sort of oversee it all, that provide that communication, that provide nutrients. They share water from one group of trees to another. If a particular group of trees isn't getting enough water, they'll share that water. And the mother tree will sort of oversee not just her own species, but other species of trees and plants as well, and microbes in the soil. To me, it's such a beautiful picture. I've always wondered, a few years ago we went to the redwood forest, and it's so peaceful. And I've always wondered where that comes from. And I think a great deal of it after reading this book is the mother tree. What a beautiful idea that we get peace from a mother tree, that we experience that. Now, I have to say that this hasn't been a peaceful week for most people. Of course, ongoing conflict, war in Ukraine, but the war in our own country, the shooting of 19 children and 2 teachers. I guess more were shot. Some are in the hospital. And our prayers for them. As it's hard to have a sense of peace. But as I've worked with that in my own faith, I realize that there is a kind of peace. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. Peace comes from the presence of grace. And so I looked for where there's grace. There's grace in those teachers that sacrifice their lives for their children, standing between the gunmen and the children and giving up their own lives. There's grace. You know, in these mass shootings, you see human beings at their worst, and you see human beings at their best. And you look for that grace. And there's a sense of peace that doesn't take away the grief and the outrage, but there's a sense of peace underneath it all that comes from the grace that is there. St. Paul in his letters often used grace and peace as a greeting or as a farewell. Grace and peace. Grace and peace are not two different things. Here's two things I want you to have. They're two connected things, grace and peace. The effect of peace is to bring grace into the world. The effect of grace is to cause peace. Now, before I get off the grief and the outrage of the mass shooting and the others too that have happened more and more frequently, I have to say if we're to have any peace of mind, any peace at all about this, it is that we're willing to do something, not just pray. I hate to see him downgrade prayer because prayer is so important, but just prayer is not enough in these happenings, these mass shootings that are happening over and over again. And so we're divided on this. The gospel lesson told us that Jesus wanted us to be as one and to share God's love. So if we could just talk about it in a way that we could come together and do something together and incite our politicians to do something as well. Yes, mental illness certainly plays a part in this, and we need to do all that we can to care for the mentally ill and have alerts when the mental illness is turning to danger toward other people or toward themselves. And yes, security is something that we should always consider. And I'm a teammate. I go into Lincoln Northeast High School every week, and I've been impressed with what they and Lincoln Public Schools have done in terms of safety and security. They're doing all they have with the resources that they have. But it can't just be those things. Once I heard a commentator say, it really struck me. He said, once an 18-year-old with a military-style weapon gets into the parking lot, no matter how good the security is, there's going to be death and destruction one way or another. So we have to go back further and do something about it before it gets to that. And I think there's certainly reasonable gun control that the majority of people in the United States agree on. Background checks. For myself, I just like to ban assault weapons. I mean, in what world is it appropriate and safe for an 18-year-old to have a birthday and go to the store and buy a military weapon and as many bullets as he wants and nobody say anything or do anything until he causes so much destruction? So I'm there. I think we just need to commit ourselves to keep talking and doing, not just talk, but to take some action from that. You know, businesses talk about best practices, and they look at the best practices not only in their own business, but other businesses and what they're doing that's working, that's been tested, that's been tried. This gun control has been tested and tried in many places, in Australia, New Zealand, in Scotland, in Norway. They've put in stricter gun control after mass shootings, and it's made a huge difference. The mass shootings have gone away. we have a different culture, a larger culture, and so we need to look at everything. But if we're going to have peace and our children are going to be safe, we need to do something, and that's the peace effect. We need to do something as people of grace, offering grace to our children and to our world. Grace. When there's harm that happens, and then we have to deal with it. Like I said, I'm dealing with the grief and outrage, and how do we deal when something happens personally in our lives or otherwise? I was reading in a book by Rachel Raymond, Dr. Rachel Raymond. She's a doctor who started teaching in medical school with emotion and spirit, helping doctors to look at that and not just the physical ailment. And her name was Louisa. She's a friend of Rachel's, and she was telling Rachel one time about her grandmother. She said she has a picture of her grandmother over her desk in her home, and every morning she looks at the picture of her grandmother and remembers with thanksgiving the gift of peace, the peace effect. Because she said when she was a child, she remembered having her kitten, her pet kitten, was killed in an accident. And she went crying to her parents, and her parents said, it's okay, the cat's in heaven, and the cat's is doing all right now, and so don't worry about your cat. And she said, that didn't help me at all. She said, I was still worried, and I still missed my kitten, and I wanted my kitten back, and I prayed to God that I'd get my kitten back, and nothing happened. And so she went to her grandmother, and she told her grandmother how she was struggling and how much it hurt, and how she was praying to God that she could get her kitten back. And her grandmother took her into her lap in a rocking chair and held her. And her grandmother didn't say anything about her kitten being in heaven. She said, you know, I went through the same thing when your grandfather died, speaking to Louisa. And when he died, I prayed that he wouldn't, and then he died, and I prayed that God would give him back, and nothing happened, and that's all I could do. But what I did was to hold on to people and let them hold on to me and care for me. And Louisa said she was crying into her grandmother's shoulder, and she looked up, and her grandmother was crying too. And they just rocked, and she sat in her lap and cried. And then she said, the loneliness went away. That, not any particular words, but that time in her grandmother's lap made a difference, gave her some peace, that act of grace. So it's a grandmother's lap can be the peace effect, or a mother tree in the forest can be a peace effect, or any act of grace, little things that we can do each and every day make such a difference in the long run. The little things are the big things. Now, Fred Craddock, who was a well-known preacher in the latter 20th century, and actually taught preaching at the seminary where Kirsty's getting her doctorate, told a story one time about he did seminars around the country, and he was invited to do a seminar. He didn't say what city it was, but the people who invited him, the seminar got over on a Saturday afternoon, so the preachers could get back and preach on Sunday. But they asked him to stay over, not fly back. They paid for the flight to not fly back that night because it was cheaper if he stayed an extra day. So they put him up in a motel, and he agreed to that. Well, it was Sunday morning, and he looked around outside the motel, and it didn't appear to be in a church district. And so he went to the front desk and asked the guy if there was a church within walking distance there. And the guy said, oh, I don't know. And so he called in the other people working there that morning, 3 or 4 others. the experts. And one of them did know of a church that was just 4 blocks away. And Fred said, that's fine. That'll be a good walk. That'll be good. So he went, followed the directions, and went to this church. And the church was not real small, but not real big. When he went inside, he thought it held about 200 people, probably. And of course, that's a preacher's count, so it probably only held about 100. But he looked around, and there was a good feeling there. He thought maybe these people even built this church themselves. That is a possibility. They had everything was in good shape, and they had such a reverence for the building itself. So he sat down and waited, and as the service was getting ready to be started, the choir came in down the center aisle, and then came the person he presumed to be the preacher. And this was a large man. It was about 6'4" and 300 pounds, he estimated. But he kind of had a bumbling gait, stumbled a little bit as he came down the aisle. But nobody seemed to notice or be worried about him. And he got up to the chancel area, and there were steps there, 3 or 4 steps. And again, he kind of struggled going up the steps. Nobody, seemed to be concerned. And then when he turned to face the congregation, Fred could see that his head was misshapen, and he had really thick glasses on. So when he went to read the Bible, he held the Bible right up close where he could read it. And again, there was an affectionate kind of feeling between the people and the pastor. And he gave the sermon, and Fred Craddock, being a preaching professor, of course, gave him a grade. And you don't need to grade this morning's, by the way. Leave that to the preaching professors. Though sometimes I prefer your grade to the preaching professor. But anyway, he said he would have given him a C. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't great. It was just sort of normal content. But there was a connection with the people that he could tell was there. And so he said he would have raised the grade just because of that connection and that relational ability of the pastor and the sermon to the people who were sitting there. So he was really curious about this guy's story, how he got to be a pastor and where he came from and so on. So he was hoping, he waited in the back as other people filed through and shook his hand, and they all knew each other, and he called them by name. And he was hoping to invite him to lunch, and the pastor wasn't able to do that, but Fred still watched and waited until he had greeted everyone. And there was one woman that came through toward the end who said, I wish I knew your mother, to the pastor. And the pastor said, my mother's name was Grace, which is, Fred thought, that's kind of an odd thing to say to that statement. But anyway, the woman went through. So Fred introduced himself then and said, I was curious surprised by your response, the woman that said she wished she knew your mother, and you said her name was Grace. And he said, so what was there about that? And the pastor said, well, when I was born, I was put up for adoption. You can see looking at me that I might not have been wanted by some. But nobody ever adopted me. I went from foster home to foster home over and over again. That was my life growing up. And one day when I was 16 or 17, I saw some youth going into a church building, and I wanted to be with youth. And so I followed them in, and there I met grace, the grace of God. The grace of God. Peace doesn't come so much from the absence of conflict, but from the presence of grace. The effect of peace is to bring about grace in our world and in our lives. The effect of grace is to bring about peace, to give us peace, not an absence of conflict, because there's going to be conflict and there's going to be rough times and things to face and to do something about, but that peace effect makes such a difference in a mother tree, in a grandmother's lap, in a church fellowship of people who are friends and caring for one another. So with Paul, I offer you grace and peace. May it be yours always. Amen.